And rural areas aren't the only regions affected by the digital divide. Urban hubs face barriers as well. To discuss this, I'm joined by a local government connectivity pioneer, Mayor Sam Liccardo of San Jose. Mayor Liccardo's launched San Jose's Digital Inclusion Fund to increase broadband access, devices, and skills for low-income families. And the city is on track to connect more than 300,000 residents to the digital world by the end of 2022. Welcome, Mr. Mayor.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So just to start off with, I'd love to hear about this $24 million inclusion fund you launched. It's a public-private partnership aimed at closing the digital divide. What success has the program seen since it's launched?
Well, that fund is primarily focused on ensuring that we have digital skills in our community and ensuring particularly low-income families, seniors to grandchildren, all are able to get online and do so safely. We were able to find those resources really through partnership with local telecom companies, I should say national telecom companies. They wanted to build out small cells in our city. And we know they were having problems in lots of cities doing so quickly. And so we signed agreements that enable them to build out 4,000 small cells and pay a small fee to us that we could then use to deposit in this digital inclusion fund, and where we're partnering now with more than a dozen nonprofit community-based organizations to really help our residents develop these skills and of course to pay for connectivity in various ways. This kind of arrangement, by the way, is no longer legal under the Trump era FCC rules that just passed, I think in 2019, a year or two later. Cities are precluded from engaging in these kinds of arrangements. So we are hoping that under new leadership, we're going to see new rules from the FCC.
Okay, that's very interesting. And I want to talk about San Jose's very lofty goal of trying to connect 300,000 people by the end of 2022. I know that you set this goal amid the pandemic. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but how has the pandemic impacted this goal?
Well, if there's any silver lining here, we've had some federal resources provided, of course, in relief, and it's created a real sense of urgency. So things are moving faster than they were before. Take it back to 2016, when we first launched this sort of digital divide, digital inclusion effort. We partnered with Stanford University to figure out how big was the divide here in San Jose, and we learned that more than 100,000 people in our city of 1 million had no access to broadband. And here we are, largest city in Silicon Valley, and still we're saying that more than 100,000 people have no broadband access. So we went to work on the various approaches that we needed to see how we could improve access. What we've landed on is a community Wi-Fi project that's quite independent of this digital inclusion fund that we talked about. We're partnering with a school district, Eastside Unified, and we're building out community-based Wi-Fi, and we're adding some boosters in places where the signal might be weak to see how we can ensure we can get broadband to the home, because simply fiber to the door isn't going to work. The costs are far too high for local municipalities to be able to afford. And so we're relying on Wi-Fi today. We've been able to connect more than 100,000 residents through that free community Wi-Fi program so far. And we're on track to be able to get to that 300,000 goal by the end of 2022. Now, why are we trying to reach 300,000 when we started with 100,000 folks who weren't connected? Well, because we know even though many who were connected had very poor quality connectivity. And we know for so many of our families, particularly in the expensive cities on the West Coast, where you've got sometimes 2 or 3 families living under the same roof, you need to have a very strong signal. And we weren't getting it through those typical $10 plans that they're signing up for. So we needed a better infrastructure. And so that's what we're working on now. We know this is not forever. This is a community-based Wi-Fi program. In the next few years, we expect this will phase out, and hopefully we'll move on to better technology, probably an LTE based on those small cell distributions.
And this next question may, be connected to the community-based Wi-Fi program, but we talk about connection to the internet. That's one thing, but I'd love to talk about digital literacy training and how that's a factor in the vision for your city and a factor in connectivity. What have you done on this front?
Well, it's critical for us that we've learned to really find those trusted community partners because we know there are a lot of barriers as we're trying to get over this digital divide. And some of those are cultural, some of those are linguistic. I serve a city where perhaps 40% of our adults were born in a foreign country. And so we need to have Vietnamese and Spanish-speaking community partners who are out there working hand in hand, particularly when you're dealing with seniors. We know that's a big challenge. And what we've learned, pardon me for the video, working through the local churches and nonprofit organizations, there's a greater level of trust, certainly for the communities. And that's critical because we know there's a lot of fear. And we certainly heard that through the surveys when we were on the ground knocking on doors. Parents have a lot of fear about what their children might encounter for obvious reasons. And there's a lot of fear about scams and so forth. And so being able to get over that fear and then educating people and giving them the tools they need is absolutely critical. And I think we've seen how important that is through this pandemic, just for children to be able to learn, for their parents to be able to find jobs.
It seems that when we talk about connectivity, a lot of times we think about the rural, the connectivity divide when it comes to rural communities. However, this is a huge issue for urban communities as well. How are you reaching low-income communities or communities of color with this program? I know you just touched on that, but I'd really love to dive deeper into it because I don't think it's a conversation we have enough.
No, you're right. And, we see this at the state level and at the federal level. I think there is a bias perhaps toward middle mile investment from the federal government and from the state government here in California, in part because, frankly, the industry would love to see that kind of public subsidy of infrastructure in the middle mile. And we understand that serves rural communities, and that's important because we need to do a better job of serving our rural residents. But if you're talking about where the digital divide affects the most low-income residents, it's in our cities. And the fact that there is connectivity broadly to a city doesn't mean anything about the ability of a resident in a low-income neighborhood to actually get that access. And so that last mile investment is much more important to us in terms of reaching more people who critically need connectivity than the middle mile investment is. And it seems to me, I certainly don't oppose the idea of investing in middle mile. We need to connect our rural areas as well. But I would hope that it will be done with the fact that we are in mind that we're subsidizing industry in some way, and industry should be paying fees for the use of that publicly subsidized infrastructure. And at least in the last mile investments, we know we're serving parts of the community that absolutely cannot afford to pay. And their public investment, straight public investment, makes a lot of sense.
I guess the main question I always think of when talking about this issue with urban, or talking about the issue, as it pertains to urban communities, is what are the barriers they're facing? Because you would think that in a big city, you have access to a public library. I spoke to the executive director of the Houston Public Library earlier, and she was talking about how it's been so great for members of the community to come to that space and get access. But, that can't fix everything. Why is there such a divide in big cities, which you would at least assume have a lot of these resources?
You're right. We do have those resources. And, we've invested in community Wi-Fi at our libraries and community centers and the outdoor parking lots and so forth. But as you think about, what a child needs to learn, a 7 or 8 year old obviously can't be out there by themselves. They need to be with a parent or an adult. And that's simply not realistic in a lot of families where everybody's working 2 jobs. And we know the hours are limited in those facilities. And so having connectivity to the home is really an imperative. It's imperative for children to be able to learn. It's imperative for the grandparents to be able to get information about health that they need. And we know that there are safety barriers in many large cities that prevent people from going out into those spaces. And so we're going to do everything we can to continue to make public spaces inviting and safe and places where people can go to get connected. But the bottom line is we need connectivity to the home. And it needs to be at broadband levels. And we need, I think, more robust definitions of what broadband really means, because we know in too many of our households, we've got a lot of folks who need to get online at the same time.
It's so true, and we will definitely be paying attention to your city's work in this space. Mayor Sam Liccardo, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now back to Steve.